Newly released U.S. government files are reopening one of the darkest chapters in recent American history, and this time, the trail leads thousands of miles east. According to documents published by the U.S. Department of Justice, convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein traveled to Russia multiple times in the early 2000s, including at least one trip with former U.S. President Bill Clinton. The revelations come from thousands of records released under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, signed into law by President Donald Trump, forcing the DOJ to publish long-sealed material tied to federal investigations. Flight logs tell part of the story. Court documents linked to a lawsuit filed by Epstein accuser Virginia Giuffre show that Epstein, his longtime associate Ghislaine Maxwell, and an assistant flew to Russia on at least 3 occasions between 1992 and 2003, aboard Epstein's private Boeing 727. One trip stands out. In May 2002, the plane stopped in Novosibirsk, then continued east to Khabarovsk in Russia's Far East. On the passenger manifest, Bill Clinton, his aide Doug Band, and several others. After Khabarovsk, the group reportedly flew on to Shenzhen, China. When Epstein was questioned about that flight years later, he refused to answer. In 2016, during legal proceedings, Epstein invoked the Fifth Amendment, declining to respond to questions about the Khabarovsk trip with Clinton. The former U.S. president has repeatedly stated he had no knowledge of Epstein's criminal activities and says he severed ties with Epstein long before the financier's arrest. But the documents do not stop at travel. The files also reveal financial transfers from Epstein's accounts to Russian banks between 2008 and 2012, more than $10,000 sent to women in Russia. Regulators say those transfers fit a broader, troubling pattern. In 2020, Deutsche Bank was fined $150 million for failing to properly monitor Epstein's transactions, which included payments to Russian models and more than $800,000 in suspicious cash withdrawals. Photographs released by the DOJ show Epstein posing at landmarks in Moscow and St. Petersburg, accompanied by unidentified women. All of this emerges years after Epstein's death in a New York jail in 2019, while awaiting trial on federal sex trafficking charges, a death that continues to fuel public suspicion and political pressure. Lawmakers and advocacy groups say the newly released files are only a partial window into a much larger network, and they are demanding answers about who knew what and when. The documents raise uncomfortable questions. Why was Epstein traveling to Russia so frequently? Who else was involved? And why do so many details remain unresolved decades later? As more files surface, the Epstein case, long buried, long contested, is once again forcing the powerful into the spotlight.
America's Justice Department releases a stunning new revelation in the Epstein case. New files expose a previously hidden international connection tied to Jeffrey Epstein. Federal investigators discovered Epstein was traveling under a false passport. His legal team claims the fake passport was for security, not deception. Among the thousands of newly released Epstein files is a detail that once stunned a federal courtroom. Hidden inside a safe at Jeffrey Epstein's Manhattan mansion, FBI agents uncovered a fake Austrian passport during a 2019 raid, shortly after Epstein's arrest on federal sex trafficking charges. The passport bore Epstein's photograph, but not his name. Instead, it identified him as Marius Robert Fortelny. Issued in May 1982, the fraudulent passport listed Epstein's residence as Saudi Arabia and his profession simply as manager. Photographs released in the latest file dump show the document stamped with travel records across France, Spain, the United Kingdom, and Saudi Arabia, with trips logged throughout 1982 and into 1983. At the time, prosecutors called the discovery a major red flag. In court filings, the Justice Department argued the fake passport proved Epstein was a serious flight risk, someone with the resources, knowledge, and connections to assume false identities and disappear across borders. The passport became a central argument in the government's successful push to deny Epstein bail. Now, newly released emails add another layer. An exchange between FBI or NYPD officials and an assistant U.S. attorney shows investigators attempting to track down the real Marius Fortelny. According to the emails, Fortelny was Austrian, had once lived in Saudi Arabia, and was residing in Southampton, New York at the time. Prosecutors discussed verifying whether Fortelny's real birth date matched the one listed in the passport, and then contacting him to ask a chilling question. Why would a passport from his native country bearing his name contain Jeffrey Epstein's photograph and be found locked inside Epstein's safe? Epstein's defense team offered a very different explanation. In a memo to the judge, Epstein's lawyers claimed he acquired the passport in the 1980s during a period of frequent hijackings tied to Middle East travel. They argued it was meant purely for personal protection, to be shown to kidnappers or terrorists if needed, and insisted there was no evidence Epstein ever used it. Prosecutors weren't convinced. Epstein died in federal custody in 2019 before his case went to trial. But years later, the fake passport remains one of the most unsettling artifacts of his secretive life, symbolizing the wealth, access, and escape routes he may have believed were always within reach.